Jesus takes some of the matzah and he gives it to the apostles, and he says to the apostles, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this as a remembrance of me." And then he takes the cup of wine, saying, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Now, this passage, these two verses, is basically a flashing red light. Anyone that's familiar with the TaNaCh is going to just sit up and really react seriously to these two verses. But it's not about the Messiah. But even if we accept David Stern's misreading of the passage, it says nothing about this stone that's rejected is going to suffer and die for the sins of mankind and be resurrected. Now, he provides a list of these at least 20 passages from the TaNaCh. Even according to his own reading of these passages, even if we accept his reading, because in reality, we don't accept his reading. He's misreading these passages, as I'll show. Only one of them might allude to the idea of a Messiah suffering to atone for the sins of others. Maybe one, but he's claiming there are at least 20. So let's look at it, the first three on his list.
Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Our Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael, the man Skobac from Canada. Welcome back, Skobac. How are you today?
I'm doing okay, thank God.
Baruch Hashem, that's great. That's great news. So today we're doing Luke chapter 22.1 out of 22.2. Part 1, yep. There we go. So so you think this guy just had too much caffeine when he wrote this one, probably?
Yeah, this is like one of these chapters with a glandular problem. And it's like, I think it's like 71 verses. There's no way we're going to get through all of that. So we'll just split it in half, which I think is workable.
That sounds like a plan. That sounds like a plan.
So next time we'll do Luke 22, part 2.
Right. And we will not be live next week. We're going to skip a week. So.
I don't suspect so, but
gotcha.
You know, we'll see. We'll
okay.
Yeah, we'll keep everybody in suspense.
I like it. That sounds good. All right. Well, we'll get the show on the road then. And so take it away, sir.
Okay, so the chapter begins. This is we're getting obviously close to the end of the Gospel of Luke, and we're now heading into the Passover. We're told that the holiday of Passover was approaching. This is the first. Basically, we're looking now at the first 13 verses, which is all about preparing for the Passover festival. So we're told that it was the holiday of Passover approaching, and we're told that the chief priests and the scribes were trying to find an opportunity to kill Jesus without the masses being aware. And again, we've pointed this out in the past, that whenever the Gospels speak about the chief priests, they're really, sort of unaware of the reality that there was only one chief priest. There was only one Kohen Gadol in Israel. And it seems, when we study the beginning of this chapter, that the plotters, the conspirators here, feared public reaction if they were to publicly pull off their plans to do away with Jesus. So basically what Luke is really telling us here is that Jesus was incredibly popular with the people, with the masses. And again, this makes it impossible to fit Jesus into Isaiah chapter 53, verse 3, which tells us that the suffering servant of the Lord will be someone who is roundly despised and rejected. Jesus was certainly, by all accounts in the Christian Bible, not widely despised and rejected. And certainly after he was killed, he has become the most popular person in history. So again, that's just worth bearing in mind. Now, we're told in the development of this story that what happens is that Satan basically provoked Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12 apostles, to join with the plotters. And they agreed to give him a sum of money for his help in finding a way to betray Jesus, again, where the masses would not be around. Some of the commentaries say that basically they were hoping to pull off this, this assassination, if you will, of Jesus after Passover, meaning that during the Passover holiday, Jerusalem was packed with people. Everyone came. There was an obligation for each of the pilgrim festivals to come to Jerusalem. So they were basically, in their minds, hoping that once the crowds and the masses of people left, it'll be quieter in Jerusalem and they'll be able to pull off their plan at that time. Now, we'll begin really the major discussion now in verse 7. So we're told that then came the day of unleavened bread, the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be sacrificed. This is the Passover lamb, the Passover offering. It was sacrificed on what the Gospel of Luke here, the author says, was the day of unleavened bread. Now, I'm going to try to go through this slowly. It may be, for some people, a little bit complicated, but I'll try to make it as clear as possible. First of all, let's begin. There was no such thing as a day of unleavened bread. There was no such day in the Jewish calendar. There was no such thing that was called the day of unleavened bread. Basically, unleavened bread, we call it matzah. The simplest explanation is that matzah is made from one of 5 grains: wheat, barley, rye, oats, or spelt, and it's mixed with water, and it has to be baked before 18 minutes, meaning it has to be totally baked before 18 minutes, which is the time that the sages determined it takes for the dough to rise. So you're going to mix one of the 5 grains with water, and before it rises, it's baked. That's within 18 minutes. Leavened bread is basically the same exact thing. It's made from one of the 5 grains, but it was allowed to sit for 18 minutes without being baked, and it becomes what we call leavened bread, or in Hebrew, chametz. So what happened was, on the afternoon before the holiday of Passover, the Passover lambs were sacrificed, and the date was the 14th of Nisan. You go through the Hebrew Bible, we know that the holiday of Passover, the Passover holiday, which was biblically a 7-day holiday, it begins on the 15th day in the month of Nisan. Nisan is the first month in the Hebrew calendar. And on this day, on the day before, which is the 14th of Nisan, so in the afternoon, they would sacrifice the lambs so that they would be ready to be eaten in the evening when the holiday begins. The holiday of Passover starts at night, which was the beginning of, again, the day, so to speak. This is what sounds confusing to people. The biblical day begins at night. We know that in the book of Genesis, for example, in chapter 1, we keep on reading, and it was evening, and it was morning, day 2, and it was evening, and it was morning, day 3, and it was evening, and it was morning, day 4. So the way a biblical day is structured, don't think about day here as daytime when it's light outside, but a day like we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So the biblical day begins in the evening, at nightfall. That's when the day begins. We have evening, and then we have morning, and then it's a whole day. So the 14th of Nisan is going to be a day in which the Passover offering is sacrificed in the temple courtyard on the afternoon of the 14th. And basically, there are two things that happen, two things that take place on the 14th of Nisan, which is we call Passover Eve, right? Meaning the day before Passover. First thing that happens is by midday, approximately. So let's say by midday on the 14th of Nisan, all leavened products, so all products that had become leavened, that the mixture of one of the 5 grains and water rose, meaning it wasn't baked within 18 minutes. So they had to be removed from one's house. You had to clear out your house from leavened products. That was by midday. And then later in the afternoon, they would sacrifice the Passover lamb so that it could be eaten that evening. And again, as soon as the evening comes, it now is the 15th of Nisan. There's no such thing as, they didn't call this 14th day the day of unleavened bread. The truth is that unleavened bread had to be, the leavened bread had to be removed from one's house, but they were not allowed to eat unleavened bread, meaning the bread that would be eaten on Passover, which we call matzah, it was not to be eaten at all on the 14th, right? It was something that you had to have special. It had to be special on the holiday of Passover. So on the 14th, the day before Passover, we did not eat matzah or unleavened bread. So again, it's important to understand that many times Luke, who tries to be the most historically accurate in his presentation of the story, the narratives, he often talks too much and he says too many things, and by doing so, he really gives away his ignorance. Now, in verses 8 to 13, Jesus sends John and Peter to find a place where the group will be able to eat the Passover lamb later that night. And in verses 14 to 20, we find that Jesus now is celebrating the Passover Seder meal, the meal that we have on the evening of the 15th, which means, again, after the 14th of Nisan ends at nightfall, the 15th of Nisan begins. That's the beginning of the holiday of Passover. And that meal we call the Seder meal. So there we find Jesus celebrating the Passover Seder meal with his disciples. This is what is often the so-called Last Supper. And we know that the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke basically have the Last Supper as a Passover Seder. When we end up going through the Gospel of John in the not too distant future, we'll see that the Last Supper in John is not a Passover Seder. Now in verse 14, it says that when the hour came, he reclined at the table and the apostles with him. Now, some Christian translations render this simply as he sat at the table, when he sat at the table. But when you check the literal translations, meaning there are many Christian translations that are more literal, they try to give you the literal meaning of the Greek. So the literal meaning of the Greek is not that they sat at the table, but they reclined at the table. Now, this is significant. It's significant that the translation would be that they reclined at the table rather than simply sitting at the table, because according to rabbinic tradition and rabbinic teaching, we're supposed to recline at the Passover Seder. The reclining at the meal was seen as an expression of freedom. Passover is the holiday of our freedom from Egypt, and is a way of demonstrating and showing that we have been freed. So the tradition is, it's actually the way the Seder is supposed to be celebrated, is that we recline at the meal, at least when it comes to eating the matzah and drinking the wine. We're going to see that the Passover Seder, the meal, was organized around 4 cups of wine. So when the wine was consumed and when the matzah, the unleavened bread, is eaten, there was a requirement to actually recline. And this is significant because, again, what we find here is that Jesus is following what the rabbis taught. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus tells his followers that they have to obey everything that the rabbis teach. And so here, this is not something that you're going to find in the text of the Bible itself. This is a rabbinic, Pharisaic teaching that we recline at the Passover meal. And so it's significant that in verse 14, we find that it specifically says Jesus and his disciples reclined at the table. In verse 17, the text says that when he had taken a cup and had given thanks, he said, "Take this and share it among yourselves." So I mentioned that the Passover Seder is organized around 4 cups of wine. Now, the source of this is that they correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption that we find in the book of Exodus, chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. So there, if you read those 2 verses, the Torah says, "Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will take you out." That's one of the 4 expressions of redemption. I will take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. And then it says, I shall rescue you from their servitude. So that's a second expression. Again, the first expression is when God says, I will take you out. The second expression of redemption is when God says, I shall rescue you from their servitude. And then the next expression is where God says, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. And finally, the 4th expression of redemption is where it says in verse 7, and I shall take you to me for a people. So we have those 4 expressions of redemption. And according to those 4 expressions, the rabbinic teaching, part of the oral Torah, is that we have 4 cups of wine corresponding to those 4 expressions of redemption. So the structure of the Passover meal, there's a structure to it. As a matter of fact, the word Seder means order. There's an order to the whole evening. There are different ways in which the Seder is organized. I mentioned that there are 4 cups of wine. There's also 15 parts to the meal. So this is the order. So the structure of the Passover meal, the structure of the Seder, is to have 2 cups of wine before the meal. 2 cups of wine before the meal. And then there's a meal which begins by eating the unleavened bread, the matzah. And then the meal is followed by 2 more cups of wine. Now again, each of these cups of wine corresponds to a significant thing that's done. So for example, at the beginning of the meal, we have the first cup of wine. That is the way all Shabbat and all festival meals begin. It's basically, we call it Kiddush, the sanctification, and it's a way, in a sense, of toasting the special holiday that we're celebrating. So the meal always begins, a festival meal or a Shabbat meal always begins with a cup of wine, where we basically express the fact that we're now celebrating a special day. The next of the 4 cups of wine at the Passover meal is said with the recitation of Hallel. Hallel are a series of psalms from the book of Psalms where we praise God. Now, the Hallel is split up into two at the Passover Seder. We say half of the Hallel before the meal and half of the Hallel after the meal. The Psalms that we say before the meal are Psalms that basically speak about the Exodus from Egypt. Then we have the meal, and then the Psalms that we recite after the meal, the Hallel, the praises of God after the meal, are really referring to the future redemption, the messianic utopian redemption in the future. So the structure of the meal is that we have 2 cups of wine before the meal, and then we have the meal, again, which begins by eating the unleavened bread, the matzah, and then there are 2 more cups of wine after the meal. And we see this structure here in Luke chapter 22. So verse 17, Jesus begins with a cup of wine. That's the first thing that's mentioned. He begins with a cup of wine. In verse 19, he takes some of the unleavened bread, which is the start of the meal itself. And then in verse 20, he takes a cup of wine after they eat the meal, which is again exactly as the oral law rabbinic tradition explained how the evening should be structured. And again, we see that Jesus and his apostles are following the procedures set forth by the sages of Israel regarding the order established for the Passover meal. They were careful to do it according to the oral law. In verses 19 to 20, Jesus takes some of the matzah and he says the blessing over the unleavened bread, and he breaks the matzah, which is what's done. The matzah is broken and is distributed to the people sitting at the meal, and he gives it to the apostles, and he says to the apostles, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this as a remembrance of me." And then he takes the cup of wine in verse 20, after they had eaten, saying, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Now, this passage, these 2 verses, is basically a flashing red light. Anyone that's familiar with the TaNaCh is going to just sit up and really react seriously to these 2 verses. And I'm going to go through at least some of the issues with you.
Enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button, or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.
First of all, there's absolutely nothing ever in the TaNaCh that speaks about symbolically eating the body of the Messiah or drinking his blood. Now, again, you're all probably aware that this is an ancient dispute between the Catholics and the Protestants. Catholics take this literally, that through, they believe, the miracle of transubstantiation, the bread or the matzah at the Seder miraculously literally becomes the body of Jesus, whereas the wine miraculously becomes the blood of Jesus. Protestants maintain that this is all symbolic, which is the way I'm going to assume we're understanding this passage. But however it's taken, whether you take it literally or symbolically, there is absolutely nothing in the TaNaCh that speaks about this kind of symbolism on the holiday of Passover. That's important. it's also important, not only is there no positive mention of this kind of a ceremony or this kind of a ritual, we have to remember that the TaNaCh repeats numerous times the strict and severe prohibition against consuming blood. So the idea that Jesus is going to tell his disciples to take the wine which represents his blood and to drink that wine, this is basically very, very, impossible to square with the biblical abhorrence of consuming any blood. And we see this, again, I mentioned it's repeated many times. So I believe the first time we see this is in Leviticus chapter 7, verses 26 to 27, which basically says that any person who consumes any blood, the Torah says that soul will be cut off from its people. This is about as serious a repercussion to sin that you could have. You're not getting whipped by a wet macaroni noodle. You're not getting thrown into prison. You're not, having to go around the block and somehow, be beaten by the court or fined. None of that. You're basically spiritually going to be evaporated. Your soul will be cut off from the people of Israel. And so that prohibition, which we find, I believe, the first time in Leviticus chapter 7, verses 26 and 27, is repeated many times in Scripture. We find it in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 10. We find it in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 26. We find it in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 16 and verses 23 to 25. And we find it in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 23. So we have two things to remember. Number one, there's nothing in the scriptures, in the TaNaCh, that has anything to do with this kind of a ceremony of even symbolically consuming the bones, the flesh, and the blood of anyone, even of the Messiah. Number two, the Bible is very, very severely strict when it comes to avoiding any consumption of blood. Number three, that for the Christian Bible at this point to come up with this ritual, this ceremony of remembering the Messiah by eating bread that symbolizes his body and drinking wine that symbolizes his blood, that would violate Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, and it would violate Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32, which is the biblical prohibition of Baltosif, of not adding to any of the commandments that God gave us. God gave us 613 commandments in the Torah, and we're prohibited from basically adding to those biblical commandments. Now, I would say it's very questionable if Jesus actually instructed this at the Seder. I would tend to believe that these are the kind of words that the gospel writer, that Luke, put into the mouth of Jesus. I don't really believe that Jesus at the Seder told his followers that they should keep on doing this. They should always, when they eat the bread, the matzah, unleavened bread, they should think that it's his body, and that when they drink the wine, they should think it's his blood, for a number of reasons. Again, number one, it is so anti-Torah. Number two, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 26, what happens there? What Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 is that this ritual, which is later on, it's called the Eucharist, that was revealed to him by Jesus. Paul says that this idea of having the unleavened bread and the wine as a commemoration of his body and his blood, Paul says that Jesus revealed this to him. Now, there would have been no need for Jesus to privately reveal this to Paul if it had already been revealed by Jesus to the apostles at the Seder, at the Last Supper. So it seems that the origin of this ritual of the Eucharist was not Jesus and was not the apostles. It was later with Paul in his interaction with the Gentile movement that he was developing. And again, you have to appreciate that this idea of consuming the blood and the body of the deity that's worshipped, the pagans would do this routinely, that they would identify with the deity they were serving by consuming the blood and the body of the sacrifice offered to that deity. But that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of ritual which any person that's raised on the ethos of the TaNaCh and the oral Torah, they would gag on such a ritual. It would have been horrible. Number three, there's no evidence that the early church, meaning that the Jerusalem church, these are the original followers of Jesus, there's no evidence that they ever practiced this ritual. If you go to Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 46, where Peter recounts what they were doing back then, how they were living their spiritual lives, he doesn't mention this practice of, again, the Eucharist or what some call the Mass or whatever it's called, the communion. There are many names for it, but it's never mentioned by Peter in the book of Acts. It's not mentioned anywhere in terms of what the apostles did in the original Jerusalem church. And what's interesting is that some ancient manuscripts of Luke don't even have the last phrase of verse 19, where Jesus tells them to do this in remembrance of him. It's not even there in the original manuscripts of Luke, and some of the earlier manuscripts don't even have verse 20 at all, where he speaks about the wine representing his blood, and that's the ratification of the new covenant. It's just simply not in ancient manuscripts of Luke. Now, as many people know, one of the most heinous canards against Jewish people was the blood libel, the sick idea that we would kill Christian children in order to use their blood to bake our matzahs for Passover. Now, what would lead some sick mind to invent such an accusation? Who in the world would think of such a thing? Well, is it possible that there's a connection to it by people who had been doing this, people who had been themselves practicing this ritual of consuming bread or wafers or matzah or crackers, which they assumed was the body of Jesus, and drinking wine, which they assumed was the blood of Jesus. And this is all connected to the Passover holiday. So, it's certainly the kind of incredibly disturbing conspiracy plot that really could only arise in the mind of someone who's been already engaged in this idea of consuming the blood and body of their Messiah through these foods that are specifically eaten on Passover. And then they go from there to the incredibly absurd idea that that's exactly how Jews would prepare their matzah for Passover. They believed the blood of a Christian baby. Now, the wine of the Eucharist is supposed to represent the blood of Jesus that ratified the new covenant. Now, the new, or really a better translation is renewed covenant. So the new covenant or renewed covenant is found in Jeremiah chapter 31. Now, Jeremiah 31 is, I want to make that clear, it is a messianic prophecy. It speaks of a time when all 12 tribes will be reunited. You have to remember that at the time of Jesus, the 10 lost tribes were still lost. They were exiled about 700 years before Jesus. And at the time of Jesus in the first century, they were still the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They weren't around. But Jeremiah 31 is predicting a time when Judah and Israel, Judah was the southern kingdom, and Israel was the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes. When these 12 tribes will be reunited, and when the covenant that God made at Mount Sinai, which was the giving of the Torah, will be renewed. It doesn't say in Jeremiah 31 there's going to be a new Torah, a new revelation. It speaks about the Torah being renewed, that what was given previously at Mount Sinai is going to be renewed. How will it be renewed? Jeremiah spells it out. The earlier, let's say, version, in a sense, not version, but manifestation of the covenant was one that the Jewish people never perfectly kept. It was broken. Jews would routinely violate the Torah. So God is saying now that in this renewed covenant, the Torah is going to be implanted in their hearts. It doesn't say he's going to give a new Torah. He's going to implant the Torah in the hearts of the Jewish people, which means we're going to now observe it. By the way, whenever you study in TaNaCh this expression about having the Torah in your heart, it always means you'll be faithful and loyal to keeping it, to observing it. So this passage in Jeremiah chapter 31 is speaking about a time when the 12 tribes will be reunited, when the Torah is going to be implanted in the hearts of all 12 tribes, and the Torah will not be violated ever again. All of Israel is going to perfectly observe it. And the knowledge of God, Jeremiah tells us, is going to be embraced by every human being in the world. Now, this is what Jeremiah is speaking about. Jesus, no doubt, believed that all this was about to be fulfilled. Again, when Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, when he thought he was the Messiah, in his mind, what that meant was that he's going to bring about the prophecies that are supposed to be brought about when the Messiah comes. So he assumed that Jeremiah 31, which is a messianic prophecy, was going to be fulfilled. But like all the other messianic prophecies, none of them were fulfilled. And this is true of every messianic movement so far in our history. Every person who's claimed to be the Messiah, and we've had dozens. Jesus is not the only one. He wasn't even the most popular failed Messiah. Shabtai Tzvi in the 17th century was able to gather a much, much larger percentage of the Jewish people. But like all other failed messianic movements, this prophecy in Jeremiah, as well as all the other messianic prophecies in the Bible, failed to materialize. Not one messianic prophecy materialized, was fulfilled with Jesus. Now, what happened, obviously, is in order to survive, Christianity ultimately engineered a new concept, a novel concept of the Messiah that could accommodate a crucified Messiah. But it's important to remember that none of the ideas that were developed by Christianity, not one of them in this novel understanding of the Messiah, is found in the Hebrew scriptures, and certainly is not found in Jeremiah chapter 31. Nothing nada, zero, in Jeremiah 31 even remotely hints at the idea of ingesting the bread and wine that is supposed to symbolize the body and blood of the Messiah. Absolutely nothing in Jeremiah or anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. There's nothing in the prophecy of Jeremiah chapter 31 even hinting at the idea that the new covenant will be ratified by the blood and death of the Messiah. These are all ideas which are completely foreign to the Hebrew Bible. In verses 21 to 23, the gospel writer now has Jesus declare that there is someone at the table who will betray him. There's someone sitting here at our meal that's going to betray me, Jesus says. And he says that he's going to be killed, that I'm going to be betrayed and I'm going to end up being killed, as has already been determined, Jesus says. Jesus says that it's already been determined that I'm going to be killed. Determined where? Jesus is saying in God's plan. That it's already been determined in God's plan that I am to be killed. And the apostles, we're told, all began to wonder, which one of us is it? If Jesus is saying that one of us is going to betray him, they were obviously nervous. Which one of us is it? Now, in David Stern's New Testament commentary, David Stern was a Messianic Jew from the United States who ended up moving to Israel, and he wrote a very comprehensive, what he claims is a Jewish commentary to the New Testament. And it's not Jewish because he was a Christian, but in his commentary, he claims that there are no less, he says, than 20 prophecies, 20 passages in the TaNaCh, in the Hebrew Bible, that he says prophesy that the Messiah would suffer and die for the sins of mankind and be raised from the dead. Now listen carefully to what he says. He says there are no less than 20 passages, I'm quoting from his commentary now, no less than 20 passages in the TaNaCh that prophesy that the Messiah would suffer and die for the sins of mankind and be raised from the dead. Now, he provides a list of these at least 20 passages from the TaNaCh. What's incredible, maybe it's not so incredible if we've been following along all these years. This is, I think, the 10th year we're going through the Christian Bible. Even according to his own reading of these passages, meaning that I'm going to share with you a few of them. I'll go through the first 3 of his list. But even if we accept his reading, now, again, I'm saying even if, because in reality, we don't accept his reading. He's misreading these passages, as I'll show. But even if we accept his reading of these passages, only one of them, he's saying that at least 20, only one of them might allude to the idea of a Messiah suffering to atone for the sins of others. Maybe one. But he's claiming there are at least 20. So let's look at it, the first 3 on his list. He starts off with Isaiah chapter 49, verse 7, which he says is a passage telling us that the Messiah is hated without a cause. The Messiah is hated without a cause. Now, the truth is that the passage is not about the Messiah. The passage is about Israel, about the Jewish people. According to some, it might be about Isaiah himself. But the passage is not about the Messiah. But even if we accept his reading that it's about the Messiah, all it would be saying is that the Messiah is hated without a cause. Nothing in that passage about someone dying to atone for the sins of mankind. Where is he getting that from? Again, he has said that there are at least 20 passages that prophesy the Messiah will suffer and die for the sins of mankind and be resurrected. This is the first one on his list. And again, even if you accept his assumption that the passage is about the Messiah, it still does not talk about what he's claiming it's talking about. The second one, Psalm 118, verse 22. We actually have discussed this passage in Psalms previously. Even ma'asu habonim haita larosh pina. The stone that was rejected by the builders has become the chief cornerstone. So he says, what is this verse about? It's that the Messiah would be rejected by the rulers. Now, once again, this verse is not about the Messiah, as we've discussed. It's either about the people of Israel, because we saw that in the book of Genesis, Israel is called a stone, or it's about King David, who was rejected by his family. They didn't even assume he was a potential to be a leader in Israel. But it's not about the Messiah. But even if we accept David Stern's misreading of the passage, it says nothing about this stone that's rejected is going to suffer and die for the sins of mankind and be resurrected. The third one on his list, we don't have time to go through all 20, but just to show you, just as examples, the third one is from Psalm chapter 41, verse 10. I think in the Christian Bible, it's verse 9. So in Psalm 41, verse 10, it speaks about someone betrayed by a friend. Now, once again, this is a verse that has nothing to do with the Messiah. The easiest way of reading it is that King David is speaking about the fact that he was often betrayed. But even if we accept his, again, misreading of this passage in Psalms, it says nothing about this person who was betrayed by a friend suffering and dying to atone for the sins of mankind and then being resurrected. The rest of the passages that Stern quotes are equally irrelevant. So we're going to conclude now with verses 28 to 30, where after the apostles begin this ridiculous argument about which one of them was the greatest, the gospel writer has Jesus making another grandiose claim. He says, and you are those who have stood by me in my trials. He now says to his apostles sitting at the meal, obviously he may even mean all 12 of them, but I don't think so, because you're going to see that he can't be referring to the one that's about to betray him. But he says, and you are those who have stood by me in my trials, and just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I will grant you a kingdom, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, obviously, we know Jesus believed that he would reign as the Messiah is supposed to. I mean, Messiah is supposed to be the king of Israel. Jesus believed that he would ultimately reign as the Messiah is supposed to. And he says that his Father has granted him this kingdom. When you're reigning as a king, you're reigning over a kingdom. So Jesus again believed that he would reign as king, and that this kingdom was granted to him by his Father. Now, a number of observations. Number one, he clearly in this passage does not believe himself to be God. He's saying that God, his Father, granted him the kingdom. If he was God, God does not have to grant God a kingdom. So it's very clear that he did not see himself as equal to God, or that he saw himself as God himself. He's saying that he got his kingdom from God. Number two, of course we know that this never came to be. He was never anointed as a king, and he never spent 1 minute reigning as the king of Israel. He was never someone who reigned over the kingdom of Israel. Number three, well, obviously then, Christians are forced to read this passage as referring to Jesus' second coming, which is a very forced reading of the passage. And finally, we have to remember who were the apostles of Jesus. They were not learned men. They were not learned men. They were, on the contrary, they were ignorant people. They were very ignorant. And therefore, if they were not learned men, they were not scholars, it's impossible to see them as people who were going to ultimately judge the 12 tribes of Israel. To be a judge, you have to know not just a little bit. Like, think about it in our society. There are plenty of lawyers, and you have to go to at least 3 years of law school to become a lawyer. But a judge is a much, much higher position. So you're really at the top of the game when it comes to judging when you're a judge. And so it's really a little bit absurd for him to speak about these 12 apostles becoming judges of the 12 tribes of Israel. But again, at the time he was speaking, there weren't 12 tribes of Israel. The 10 northern tribes were lost. And what Israel was awaiting back then was the reunification of the 12 tribes. It didn't happen back then, and we're still awaiting it. God willing, it will happen very soon when the true Messiah makes his appearance. And what we'll do is, God willing, next time we meet, we'll do part 2 of chapter 22, because it is a very long chapter.
Awesome. That sounds good. And Hashem willing, if we see you next week, then that will be the plan. Good to see you again, Rabbi. You're looking great.
Thanks so much. Good to see you. Good to be here with you. And a pleasure as always. And I wish you and all the viewers a most awesome, awesome week ahead.
Thank you so much. You guys, be sure to hit that like button. Also on the YouTube channel, if you'll subscribe to subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on all notifications so you don't miss a beat there. And you feel free to share these videos with your friends. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful day, and we'll see you back tonight with Rabbi Stuart, the man Federow. Take care, everybody. Shalom.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.